Welcome to Reform Thinking. So, imagine stepping into this highly secure, pristine, completely sterile laboratory.
Okay, I am picturing it.
And you are wearing these mud-caked boots. Your clothes are just covered in grime.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is a terrible idea.
Right. You do not just feel out of place in that environment. You realize immediately that you are a dangerous contamination risk.
You're basically a walking biohazard to the clean room.
Yes, precisely.
Yeah.
And that staggering sense of being a defiled creature walking into absolute purity, well, that is the reality of the historical text we are looking at today.
It is a harsh reality check, honestly.
It really is. Because usually when we think about the stories we learned in childhood, we picture them with a soft focus lens. You know, we picture the flannel graphs in Sunday school.
Oh, yeah, the little felt characters on the board.
Yeah, there's a man, there's a flock of sheep, and there's a bush with some red and orange felt flames glued to it. It is clean, it is safe, and it is entirely manageable.
But then you step into the actual historical text, and suddenly that safe flannel graph world just vanishes.
It totally evaporates.
We are looking at a historical and theological landscape that is, quite honestly, staggering. It is the absolute definition of a paradigm shift. We move from a sanitized children's tale to a terrifying holy encounter that redefines reality.
And that is our mission today. We are taking a deep dive into two rigorous theological commentaries on Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 6.
Which is the historical account of Moses and the burning bush.
Right. We're going to unpack how this seemingly straightforward story actually provides a core basis for understanding God's nature, human limitations, and the entire scope of historical redemption.
It really covers all the bases.
It does. We're going to see how this text completely corrects the casual, modern assumptions people make about approaching God. Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the man himself and the historical reality he was living in before this event even takes place.
Yeah, to grasp what is happening here, we have to ground it in strict historical chronology. Let's lay that out. So, the sources we are examining place this event firmly in the mid-15th century before Christ, specifically around 1446 BC.
Okay, so that is a very specific date.
Right. This is based on the internal biblical dating, like 1 Kings 6.1, which places the Exodus 480 years prior to the 4th year of Solomon's reign.
And the sources contrast this with other theories written.
They do. Our sources explicitly contrast this early date chronology with later secular dating theories, which they often try to push the event back to the 13th century BC based on speculative archaeological reconstructions.
Interesting. So they are holding a firm line on the timeline.
Yes. And sticking to the 1446 BC timeline gives us a very clear picture of the political and cultural atmosphere. We're talking about the 18th dynasty of Egypt.
And we should clarify, this is not some struggling backwater nation. This is a global superpower at the absolute height of its cultural and military dominance.
Oh, it is the zenith of Egyptian wealth. The 18th dynasty possessed an unstoppable military machine, complete with advanced chariots and weaponry.
So they were basically the undisputed heavyweight champions of the ancient world.
Completely. They had monumental architecture, a highly educated court system, and a deeply entrenched religious structure.
With all those different gods, right?
Yeah, they worshipped a vast pantheon of animal-headed deities, and the entire society was built around satisfying these gods.
And Moses is right in the middle of all of this.
He was. Moses spent the first 40 years of his life in the absolute center of that opulence. He was a prince, raised in the royal courts, thoroughly educated in the wisdom of the Egyptians.
So he had everything.
He had prestige, wealth, and worldly confidence. He was trained to rule.
But then comes the crash. I mean, he tries to take matters into his own hands, kills an Egyptian taskmaster to save a Hebrew slave, and ends up fleeing for his life.
A total fall from grace.
He goes from being a prince of the greatest empire on earth to a fugitive in the barren wilderness of Midian. And he stays there for 40 years.
40 long years.
The contrast is mind-boggling. You go from walking marble floors and reading the most advanced literature in the world to staring at dirt and sheep for 4 decades.
Yeah, the sources refer to this dramatic shift as hidden providence.
Hidden providence. I like that phrase.
The text frames Moses' obscurity not as a historical accident, and certainly not as wasted time. Instead, it is the active execution of a divine decree.
So it was all intentional.
Very intentional. The authors point out that God often strips individuals of worldly confidence and human political schemes before giving them a holy task.
Wow. So the Egyptian prince routine had to go.
Right. The pride, self-reliance, and political maneuvering Moses developed in Egypt had to be broken in the desert wastes. He had to learn absolute dependence before he could be used for the impending rescue operation.
I keep picturing a massive tree. If you want a tree to withstand a hurricane, it cannot just sprout up overnight.
No, of course not.
There is this silent, unseen process where the root system grows deep underground for years and years. Nobody sees the roots.
Right, it is all hidden.
It looks like nothing is happening on the surface. But that hidden growth in the dark is what keeps the tree from snapping when the wind hits.
That is a great visual.
It just feels like God is growing Moses' root system in total obscurity.
So is it fair to say God essentially put Moses in a 40-year timeout to break his self-reliance?
That is a highly accurate analogy for hidden providence. The silence of those 40 years was actively preparing his root system.
It's so counterintuitive to how we do things.
It is. The ordinary, mundane path of his new life was the precise mechanism designed to position Moses where he needed to be. The sources highlight the Hebrew vocabulary here, specifically the word used for his new job.
Oh, what is the word?
It is the Hebrew participle roi, which translates to shepherding.
Let's pause on that word. What makes that specific grammatical choice so significant for his psychological state? Well, this specific grammatical form denotes an ongoing, habitual, ordinary occupation. Moses is not on some grand, heroic, mystical quest in the desert.
He's not slaying dragons or anything.
No, he is doing the daily, repetitive, mundane work of caring for another man's livestock. He is working for his father-in-law.
Which has to sting, given his background.
Culturally, this is a massive degradation. The ancient Egyptians considered shepherding to be an abomination.
Oh, wow. I did not realize that.
Yeah, so Moses has been reduced to the lowliest possible status in the eyes of the culture that raised him. He is a nobody doing a nobody's job in the middle of nowhere.
And then without any warning, an ordinary Tuesday of shepherding shifts into a supernatural encounter.
Just out of the blue.
Moses leads the flock to the far side of the wilderness, to Mount Horeb, and he encounters a physical anomaly that defies all natural laws. He sees a burning bush.
Right. The text describes the angel of the Lord appearing to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush.
And the wording there is very specific, isn't it?
It is. The visual anomaly is captured in a beautiful grammatical paradox in the Hebrew text. The sources detail how the active participle bor, meaning burning, is combined with the passive pual participle ananu ukal, meaning was not consumed.
Bor and ananu ukal. Right. So it is a real active fire generating actual heat and light, but the physical wood of the bush is completely unaffected.
Yes.
It is not turning to ash. The moisture is not boiling out of the leaves. It just exists in a state of suspension.
And this visual impossibility introduces a massive theological concept known as aseity.
Aseity. Let's break that down for the listener.
Aseity refers to absolute self-existence and independence. Think about the mechanics of a natural chemical fire.
Okay.
A regular fire is incredibly needy. It requires external fuel, like wood, oxygen, dry leaves, to sustain its existence. The moment it exhausts its host, it dies. It must consume to live.
It is parasite, basically.
Precisely. It takes from its environment. But this divine fire at Horeb is entirely independent. It generates its own existence.
That is wild to think about.
It really is. It requires absolutely nothing from the physical world to burn brightly. It displays that the Creator is entirely self-sufficient, needing nothing from his creation, while his creation depends entirely upon him.
And how does that compare to the religion Moses grew up with?
The sources contrast this heavily with the pagan gods Moses would have known in Egypt. Deities like Ra or Osiris were believed to need daily offerings, food, and human appeasement to maintain order.
So they were needy gods.
Very needy. Yahweh, appearing in this self-sustaining flame, is demonstrating that he requires no human fuel to exist.
Here's where it gets really interesting. God has this infinite self-sustaining glory requiring no fuel from the universe. But look at where he chooses to display it.
Yeah, the contrast is stark.
The sources talk about the specific botany of this scene, which feels so intentional.
The botany of grace, as it is framed by the commentators. The Hebrew word used for the bush is hasaneh.
Hasaneh. And what kind of bush is that?
This is a highly rare noun referring to a low, dry, thorny desert bramble. This is not an accident of geography.
God did not just pick whatever plant happened to be nearby.
No. The sources contrast this specific plant with the majestic cedars of Lebanon or the strong oaks that were frequently used in ancient Near Eastern pagan myths to signify divine presence.
Oh, right. Because in mythology, the gods always show up in these grand ways.
Exactly. When pagan cultures invented stories of the gods coming to Earth, they always had them dwelling in impressive towering trees. God bypasses the towering, impressive vegetation and chooses a scrubby, prickly weed.
It is pure irony. God chooses a fragile, prickly, unimpressive weed to host his glorious presence.
It is brilliant.
Does this symbolize God's willingness to dwell among afflicted, suffering people without destroying them? Because Israel and Egypt, sweating under the whips of the taskmasters, was essentially a thorny, suffering bush at this point.
That is the direct connection the sources make. The selection of the lowly thorn bush symbolizes God's presence in the midst of his afflicted, humble people.
Wow. So he is right there in the mess with them.
Right. The fire of his presence is there to comfort and preserve them, not to consume them. It shows that God condescends to dwell, not in worldly majesty, but in the midst of humiliation and lowliness. He identifies with the degraded state of his people.
Moses sees this physical impossibility, self-sustaining fire in a fragile weed, and he decides to investigate.
Naturally.
He says, I will turn aside to see this great sight. He has this very human, almost scientific curiosity. He wants to figure out the mechanics of what he is looking at.
He thinks he is just observing a weird natural phenomenon.
Correct, like an ancient scientist.
The Hebrew indicates an intensive, immediate personal resolve. He wants to know why the bush is not burnt. He is trying to master the situation intellectually.
But he doesn't get very far with that.
No, he does not. This human autonomy, this desire to analyze and master the phenomenon on his own terms, is immediately halted.
Stopped in its tracks.
The sources contrast Moses' scientific curiosity with a sovereign verbal arrest. God calls out from the bush, Moses, Moses.
The double name. You hear that a few times in the biblical text, like Abraham, Abraham, or Martha, Martha.
Yes.
It is so urgent. It completely shatters the illusion that Moses is the one initiating this interaction.
It demands absolute submission. The visual wonder was only meant to attract his attention. The spoken word is what establishes authority.
The voice takes over.
Moses cannot investigate this fire on his own terms. God immediately issues spatial prohibitions, draw not nigh hither, meaning do not come near, and the requirement to remove his sandals.
He has to take off his shoes. I want to talk about the ground for a second because the text calls it holy ground.
Yeah, that is a key phrase.
We need to clarify what that means because people often assume the dirt itself became magical.
Like it has special properties.
Right. The sources make a really specific point about the dirt at Horeb.
They clarify that the dirt itself possessed no inherent magical qualities. This directly contrasts with concepts of physical relics or locations that are thought to be permanently infused with sacred energy.
It is not glowing radioactive dirt.
No. The ground at Horeb became holy strictly because of the immediate active presence of Jehovah.
Okay.
Holiness means consecration, being set apart from common use. The moment God's presence lifted, it was just ordinary desert sand again.
That brings us right back to the sterile laboratory analogy from earlier.
Oh, yeah, the clean room.
You do not just wander into a secure biolab off the street with your dirty shoes and grab a microscope. You have to follow strict decontamination protocols.
You have to suit up.
You have to put on the hazmat suit. Or think about approaching a royal monarch in the ancient world. You do not casually stroll up to the throne and offer a high five.
They would execute you.
Exactly. There are rigid boundaries, protocols, and postures required. So how does the removal of sandals act as a confession of human defilement in this context?
Removing the sandals serves as a physical, symbolic confession that the human creature is fallen, defiled by contact with accursed earth, and completely unworthy to stand before absolute purity.
So it is admitting his own filth.
Right. The dust on his sandals represents the common fallen world. Taking them off is an acknowledgement of total depravity meeting infinite holiness.
That is heaven.
And this brings us to a major critique leveled by the authors of our source material against modern religious practices.
Right. Let's look at what the texts say about this. We want to impartially report their stance here. According to the source material, there is a strong argument made against modern, seeker-sensitive pragmatism and entertainment-driven religion.
Yes.
The authors argue that contemporary culture treats God as a therapeutic assistant, someone who exists to fix our earthly problems and make us feel fulfilled.
The sources contend that modern evangelicalism often attempts to blur the boundary between the sacred and the profane in a misguided quest for cultural relevance.
So trying to make God too casual.
Yes. They assert that this passage demands what is called the regulative principle of worship.
Let's define that.
This is the doctrine that humans must approach God only on his commanded terms, governed by holy dread, rather than pragmatic schemes or human imagination.
That is a very strict boundary.
The authors argue that if Moses had to halt and remove his shoes, modern worshipers cannot casually approach God without reverence. They see this text as a definitive strike against treating worship as a casual, user-friendly experience.
It is a sobering thought, regardless of where you fall on that spectrum. It shifts the focus entirely away from human comfort.
Totally.
And that visual sign of the fire, as spectacular as it was, meant nothing without the verbal revelation that follows. God does not just leave Moses guessing about who is in the fire.
The visual sign was incomprehensible without the verbal key.
He speaks.
God announces, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob."
That specific phrase is a massive historical anchor. God does not introduce himself as a generic spirit of the desert. He ties himself to specific historical individuals.
It links the current, immediate crisis of Israel's bondage in Egypt back to the ancient sovereign oath sworn centuries earlier in Genesis.
So it is all connected.
Yes. By using this formula, God proves he is not a newly invented deity. He is the faithful Lord of history. He remembers his promises across generations.
That continuity is huge.
The sources highlight this continuity. The God who promised the land and the seed to Abraham is the exact same God stepping into history right now to rescue the descendants.
Just imagine being Moses in that exact second. You have spent 40 years thinking your life is over, thinking your people are abandoned in Egyptian slavery.
Living as a nobody.
Right. You are staring at a fire that does not need wood, and out of that fire, you hear the names of your own ancestors spoken aloud. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob.
It is chilling.
It is no wonder his reaction is pure terror. The text says he hid his face. Hearing those historical facts instantly shifts Moses from a curious scientist to a terrified creature.
And the sources analyze this reaction of fear quite closely. They argue that this fear is not a lack of faith, but rather the proper necessary consequence of the law of God's holiness crashing upon the human conscience.
So he is reacting exactly the way he should.
Yes. When Moses hears those names, he realizes this is not a natural puzzle to be solved. It is the creator of the universe.
The ultimate reality check.
The absolute purity of God exposes the absolute unholiness of the man. It drives away all his carnal security. He hides his face because he realizes that a fallen creature cannot look upon the Holy One and live.
And this specific dynamic, a holy God initiating a rescue for a sinful people, leads the sources to heavily refute some very popular modern political interpretations of the Exodus story.
Yes, this is a major point they make. The sources explicitly reject reading the Exodus narrative as a socio-economic liberation movement.
We need to explain their stance here impartially, because I can see someone reading this and saying, wait, God is about to crush the Egyptian taskmasters and free a slave class? How is this not about horizontal socio-political liberation?
It seems like an obvious reading to some.
Right. So how do the sources separate the theological from the political? Because they argue against viewing this through the lens of Marxist class warfare, liberation theology, critical race theory, or secular social justice.
According to the commentary provided, the authors argue that the crisis at Horeb and the subsequent deliverance from Egypt were not primarily about horizontal socio-political conflict.
Okay, so what was it about, in their view?
They assert it was a vertical theological rescue. In their view, the ultimate problem facing humanity in this text is not systemic economic inequality, but human sin standing before divine holiness.
Oh, I see.
The bondage in Egypt is seen as a physical manifestation of spiritual bondage. Therefore, they argue, the Exodus is a historical execution of a theological covenant, initiated solely by God to redeem a people for his own worship, rather than a blueprint for modern secular political revolutions.
So they see the politics as secondary to the theology.
Right. They point out that God's stated goal is not just to give them fair wages, but to bring them to this very mountain to worship him.
So in their view, it is strictly about God rescuing people for his glory, not just overthrowing a corrupt government system.
Correct.
And that vertical tension, this terrifying, unapproachable holiness that makes Moses hide his face, raises a massive question.
Which is?
If God is this holy, and we are defiled creatures forced to hide our faces, how can humanity ever interact with him safely? How do we survive the sterile laboratory without being destroyed by the decontamination process?
Yes. The sources connect this ancient text to its future fulfillment to answer that.
Oh, this is the really good part. Let's get into that.
This brings us to the Christological fulfillment of the passage. The sources explain the historical theological view that the angel of the Lord who speaks from the fire is actually the second person of the Trinity.
The eternal Logos, operating in history before Bethlehem.
Correct. The pre-incarnate Logos. This view holds that the Son of God has always been the active, glorious mediator between God and man, even before he took on human flesh.
And the sources draw a brilliant parallel between the burning bush and the incarnation of Christ.
They do. They use the theological term hypostatic union.
Let's define that, because it is a dense term, but it is crucial for understanding how the sources link Exodus to the New Testament.
The hypostatic union is the doctrine that Jesus Christ is one person with two distinct natures.
Fully God and fully man.
Right. The sources argue that the burning bush is a vivid type or foreshadowing of this reality, just as the uncreated infinite fire dwelled within the fragile, thorny bush without destroying the physical wood.
The infinite divine nature, united with human flesh in the womb of the Virgin Mary without destroying Christ's humanity.
Yes.
That is a staggering image.
It really connects the dots visually.
The fire is in the wood, but the wood is not consumed. Deity is in the humanity, but the humanity remains intact. It is the ultimate expression of the botany of grace.
It goes further than just an illustration, though.
How so?
The sources contrast the terrifying holy ground of Mount Horeb with the access granted to believers in the New Testament, specifically referencing Hebrews chapter 12.
At Horeb, Moses was commanded to keep his distance in fear. The holiness of God was an absolute barrier. Draw not nigh hither.
But Hebrews 12 declares that believers have not come to a mountain that burns with fire and blackness, which forced people to stand far off, but to Mount Zion, to the mediator of a new covenant.
So what does this all mean for the listener?
Well,
Moses had to stay back to avoid being consumed by that fire. He had no hazmat suit. If we connect this to the bigger picture, how does Christ change that dynamic? How does he turn a barrier of fear into an open door of grace, allowing us to walk right into the sterile lap?
the sources outline that Christ's substitutionary atonement is the key. On the cross, Jesus Christ actively absorbed the consuming fire of God's holy wrath against sin.
Wow, absorb the fire.
Yes, the judgment that should have fallen upon the thorny bush of sinful humanity fell instead upon the perfect substitute.
He took the hit.
Because Christ satisfied the absolute demands of divine justice, the barrier of access is shattered, the veil in the temple is torn.
And so people are no longer kept at a distance.
Right. Sinners who are united to Christ are no longer told to stay away in terror. They are invited to draw near with boldness because the fire of judgment has already been exhausted on their Savior.
It is a complete reversal of the spatial prohibitions. Instead of stay back, it becomes draw near.
The whole paradigm flips.
And this logical progression, from the self-sustaining fire to the sovereign arrest to the final fulfillment, leads us into some fascinating territory regarding how this single ancient event is used by the authors to argue for very specific modern doctrinal boundaries.
Yeah, they use this text as a major foundation for several debates.
It is wild to think that this one moment with a bush dictates how these authors view modern church structure and theology. Let's pull the thread on how absolute divine independence, that fire needing no wood, leads these authors straight to the doorstep of monergism.
The source material uses the burning bush to argue forcefully for the monergism of sovereign grace.
Let's lay out what that means.
Monergism is the belief that God alone is the active agent in salvation, requiring no cooperation from the human will.
Okay, God works alone.
The authors assert that just as the self-sustaining fire at Horeb required absolutely no fuel from the dry bush to burn brightly, God requires absolutely no human assistance, merit, or cooperation to execute his decree of salvation.
He brings the fire, humanity brings nothing.
That is their position.
I hear what the authors are saying about monergism, that God needs no human fuel. But stepping into the shoes of someone reading this for the first time, playing devil's advocate here,
Sure.
doesn't Moses choosing to walk over to the bush and choosing to take off his shoes imply some human cooperation? How did the sources reconcile his physical actions with the idea that he contributes nothing?
The authors would counter that Moses' actions were entirely responsive, not initiating. Moses was walking the opposite direction until God manifested the fire.
Oh, I see. He was just doing his job.
Right. Moses was completely content to stay in Midian until God issued the sovereign arresting call of Moses.
So God makes the first move.
The sources argue that the human will responds only because God's sovereign grace acts first to awaken it and command it. They explicitly contrast this with what they call the Arminian view.
And what is that view?
That suggests human free will plays a deciding cooperative role in accepting or rejecting salvation. The sources argue the text refutes that idea by showing God's absolute independence in initiating the covenantal rescue.
Okay, that clarifies their stance. Now, what about the debate regarding spiritual gifts and revelation?
Ah, yes.
The sources leap from God speaking from a bush to arguing for cessationism. Wait, I understand they prioritize the spoken word over the visual sign here, but how do the sources leap from this specific interaction in 1446 BC to the conclusion that all physical signs ceased forever?
They objectively state the view that the miraculous sign-attesting gifts of the Holy Spirit, along with direct physical visions like a burning bush, ceased with the completion of the written biblical canon.
So no more burning bushes today.
Right. The authors argue that, at Horeb, the visual wonder was subordinate. It merely acted to point Moses to the spoken revelation.
The fireworks were just to get his attention.
In their view, since humanity now possesses the completed, written Word of God, the signs are no longer necessary. They argued that believers today should not seek private revelations, mystical signs, or literal burning bushes, because the Scriptures are entirely sufficient for all knowledge of God.
So they are cautioning against looking for new signs in the sky and pointing people strictly back to the text of Scripture.
Yes.
And there's one more structural debate they touch on based on God's introduction of himself. Dispensationalism versus covenantalism.
Yeah, this is a big one. One of the sources notes that God's self-identification as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob reinforces a dispensational distinction.
Relaying this impartially, the source argues that this specific naming formula confirms national and territorial promises given to the physical descendants of Israel.
Yes. The author uses this title to reject replacement theology, which is the idea that the church has permanently replaced national Israel in God's plan. They argued the text proves God still maintains distinct future plans for the physical nation of Israel based on those ancient patriarchal covenants. The God of history does not abandon his specific historical promises.
It is genuinely fascinating how interconnected it all is. We have gone from a prince fleeing an opulent Egyptian dynasty to a shepherd spending 40 years in the hidden providence of the desert.
And we have looked at this self-sustaining fire demonstrating God's absolute independence.
Right. And the lowly bramble bush demonstrating his condescending grace. We have seen human scientific curiosity arrested by a holy summons, demanding the removal of sandals and establishing boundaries that critique casual, consumer-driven worship.
We have traced how the spoken covenantal name anchored the deliverance in history, refuting modern secular political readings.
And we have seen how the unconsumed wood points forward to the hypostatic union of Christ, the perfect mediator who absorbed the fire of wrath so defiled creatures could draw near to the holy ground.
It really covers an immense amount of theological ground.
It changes everything about how you read this text. It is not just a flannel graph story. It is the architectural blueprint for how God relates to fallen humanity.
It certainly is.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Consider that fire that needed no fuel.
Okay.
If God is entirely self-sufficient, if he possesses absolute aseity and needs absolutely nothing from the physical universe to burn brightly, then his decision to call Moses or to interact with humanity at all is not driven by need.
Wow. He does not need us.
Right. He is not lonely. He is not lacking anything that we can provide. So what does it say about human value that our Creator seeks us out? Not to extract fuel from us to satisfy his own deficiencies, but simply to share his unconsumed light.
That is a beautiful thought.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Ah.
Until next time.